Hello friends, please like and subscribe to the channel and enjoy the stories. Chapter 1. The Day the Stars Stood Still. The sun hung low on the horizon, its golden rays slipping through the rustling leaves of a century-old oak tree, casting long, dappled shadows on the cobbled streets of the small town of Elmsworth. Among the soft murmur of the world around her, Amelia stood at the edge of the bridge, her eyes fixed on the river below, the gentle ripples catching the light. She had always been drawn to the water, its quiet promise of something deeper, something untold. But today her gaze was elsewhere, not at the water, not at the sky, but at the figure standing at the far end of the bridge. He was leaning against the stone railing, his face turned toward the setting sun, his features lit in an almost ethereal glow. There was something about him that pulled her in, a magnetic force that she couldn't explain. He didn't look like anyone from Elmsworth. His black leather jacket, the worn jeans, and the boots that had seen better days all spoke of someone who didn't belong here. His hair, dark as the night, fell loosely over his forehead, and there was a hint of a shadow beneath his eyes, as though he'd been lost in thoughts too deep to share. Amelia, normally the picture of composure, felt an odd flutter in her chest as she watched him. She wasn't the type to believe in love at first sight, or even fate. But there was something undeniably magnetic about this man. It wasn't just his appearance. It was the air around him, a certain heaviness, a sense that the world might shift on its axis if he took a single step. She forced herself to look away, determined not to be entranced by some fleeting illusion. She had enough of that, enough of chasing dreams and never catching them. Yet, as if drawn by an invisible thread, her feet moved toward him, slow at first, then quicker, almost as though something inside her was guiding her. She couldn't explain it. She just had to get closer. The man, sensing the movement, turned slightly, and their eyes met for the briefest of moments. Amelia felt her heart skip a beat, and for the first time in a long while, she wasn't sure whether she was dreaming or awake. "You don't belong here, do you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The words surprised her, but they had slipped out before she could stop them. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he gave her a small, almost imperceptible smile, the corners of his mouth twitching up. "No," he said, his voice low and smooth, carrying a certain weight. "But I think you do." Amelia blinked, momentarily thrown off balance by the strange certainty in his tone. "What do you mean?" "Just a feeling," he replied cryptically. "That maybe you've been waiting for something you don't even know yet." Her breath caught in her throat. There was no way he could know that. She hadn't told anyone about the longing she felt, the emptiness that gnawed at her every day. She had convinced herself it was just a phase, but his words, his piercing gaze, made it all feel too real. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching between them like an unspoken agreement, a shared understanding of something neither could name. "So," he began after a long pause, his eyes scanning her face, "what's your name?" "Amelia," she replied, her voice steady despite the tremor she could feel in her fingertips. She had always been careful with her words, guarding them like precious treasures, afraid that if she spoke too much, too honestly, something would break. But with him, it felt different, safe, somehow. "Amelia," he repeated, his mouth curling slightly as he tested the name on his lips. "It's a beautiful name. And you?" She raised an eyebrow, intrigued by the question. "You don't know your own name?" He chuckled softly, the sound like the rustling of leaves. "I think it's better if I don't remember. The name doesn't matter." Amelia frowned. "What do you mean?" "Everyone has a name." His eyes softened, a fleeting shadow of something much older than the youthful face he wore. "Not everyone," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "Some of us forget. Some of us choose to." She opened her mouth to ask what he meant, but before she could speak, the world around them seemed to shift. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, and the golden light from the sun flickered, casting strange, elongated shadows across the ground. It was as though the world itself had paused. The leaves hung in the air, motionless, the river's ripples stilled like glass. Time, for the briefest moment, stood still. "What's happening?" Amelia whispered, her eyes widening as she looked around, feeling the world shift under her feet. The man, however, remained calm. "It's happening," he said softly. The moment we've both been waiting for. Time doesn't always work the way we think it does. Before Amelia could ask more, the world snapped back into motion with a suddenness that made her dizzy. The leaves resumed their rustling, the river flowed again, and the sun continued its descent behind the horizon. But the man, he was gone, vanished like smoke in the wind. Amelia stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. What had just happened? Was it a dream? She ran to the spot where he had been standing, searching frantically for any trace of him. But there was nothing, no sign that he had ever been there. She let out a shaky breath, trying to make sense of it all. Perhaps it had been an illusion. Perhaps she had imagined it. But deep down in the quiet corners of her heart, she knew something had changed. Something had shifted. And she was no longer the same. The next morning, as she walked to the market, something caught her eye. A small, faded photograph pinned to the notice board. It was a picture of a man, wearing a leather jacket, standing in front of a bridge. The face was blurry, indistinct, but the eyes, those same dark eyes, were unmistakable. Underneath, a single line of text read, "Have you seen this man? He vanished 3 years ago." Amelia's blood ran cold. It couldn't be. Could it? And just like that, the world she thought she knew unraveled. Chapter 2. The Unraveling. Amelia stood frozen, her heart hammering in her chest as she stared at the photograph pinned to the notice board. It was him, the man from the bridge. There was no mistaking those dark, penetrating eyes, eyes that had seen too much and hidden too many secrets. Yet, the photograph was dated 3 years ago, and the caption was clear. He vanished. She reached out, her fingers trembling as she touched the paper, as though trying to draw some kind of answer from it. But the more she stared at the image, the more it seemed to distort, the lines of the photograph warping like ripples on a disturbed pond. The world around her began to blur, and for a moment, she thought she might faint. But before she could react further, a voice broke through the haze, sharp and unfamiliar. "Are you all right?" Amelia spun around, her breath catching in her throat. A woman stood behind her, her expression one of concern. She was tall, with short-cropped hair and an air of quiet authority. Her eyes, a deep shade of green, studied Amelia closely. "Yeah," Amelia said quickly, forcing a smile, her pulse still racing. I thought I recognized someone in the photograph." The woman raised an eyebrow, her gaze flicking back to the notice board. "You knew him?" Amelia swallowed hard, unable to explain the strange connection she felt, the inexplicable pull that the man's eyes had on her. "No," she said after a moment, shaking her head. "But I saw him yesterday." The woman's eyes narrowed. "You saw him? Are you sure?" Amelia nodded, the weight of her words sinking in. "Yes, on the bridge, right there by the river. He said something to me, and then he disappeared." The woman studied her for a long time, her face unreadable. "You don't know who he is, do you?" Amelia shook her head again. "No, but something's not right. It's too strange." The woman glanced around as if making sure no one was listening, then stepped closer. "You need to be careful. There are things in this town, things that don't make sense. People like him. They come and go, and nobody really knows why." "Who is he?" Amelia asked, her voice barely above a whisper, her curiosity burning brighter than ever. "He's part of a story that nobody talks about," the woman replied, her voice low and guarded. "A story of time, of disappearances, of people who slip through the cracks and vanish without a trace, and you're not the first to be drawn in by him." Amelia felt a chill run down her spine. "What do you mean? What happened to him?" The woman's eyes softened, and for a moment Amelia thought she might see a flicker of empathy in them. "He's not like everyone else, and neither are you, but you'll figure that out soon enough." Before Amelia could ask anything more, the woman turned on her heel and walked away, disappearing into the crowd as though she had never been there. Shaken, Amelia stood by the notice board, the photograph still burning in her mind. The man from the bridge, the one who had vanished, the one who had disappeared 3 years ago, was somehow tied to her in a way she couldn't understand. It was as though their fates were linked, destined to converge, to unravel. But how? Without realizing it, Amelia found herself walking back to the bridge, her feet moving on their own as if they had a destination in mind. The town was quieter now, the streets bathed in the soft, golden light of the late afternoon. The bridge loomed ahead, and she approached it with a mixture of anticipation and dread. As she stepped onto the bridge, she glanced around, half expecting the man to appear again, but there was no sign of him. The world seemed still, almost too still, and the silence hung heavy in the air. Amelia walked to the center of the bridge and leaned against the stone railing, staring down at the river. The same river that had caught her attention the day before, the one that had mirrored the strange sensation in her chest. Was it possible that there was something more here? Something hidden, something that only she could see. Suddenly, a voice broke the stillness. "You came back." Amelia spun around. There he was, standing at the far end of the bridge, his dark eyes locking with hers. His appearance was no less startling than it had been the day before, and for a brief moment Amelia thought she might be dreaming again. "You're real," she whispered, half in disbelief. He took a step toward her, his movements slow and deliberate, as though he were giving her time to process. "I'm real, Amelia, but so are you, and that's why you're here." Her heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean? Why am I here? Why did you disappear yesterday? What's happening?" The man stopped a few feet away, his expression unreadable. "It's complicated. Time is complicated, the world is complicated, and you, Amelia, are about to understand just how much." Amelia felt a sharp pang of fear. "What do you mean? What am I supposed to understand?" He smiled, a faint, almost sad smile. "That the world isn't as fixed as you think it is, that the past, the present, and the future are all intertwined in ways you can't yet comprehend, and that your life, just like mine, is caught in the threads of time that stretch and bend until they break." Amelia's breath caught in her throat. "What happens when they break?" "Everything changes," he replied softly. "And sometimes, when the threads break, they bring people back." Before Amelia could process his words, the world around her seemed to shift again. The air grew colder, the sky darkened, and the river below her shimmered with an unnatural light. She looked at the man, his face was becoming clearer, sharper, but there was something different about him now, something more distant. "Wait," she said, reaching out for him. "What are you talking about? Are you telling me?" The man's form began to fade, his features blurring once more. "You'll understand soon, Amelia. When the threads break, you'll see." And just like that, he was gone. Amelia stood there on the bridge, the night settling around her, her mind reeling with more questions than answers. She didn't know what was happening, but she felt the weight of it. Like the gravity of the world was pulling her toward something. Something inevitable. Something that would change everything. And as the stars began to blink into existence above her, Amelia realized that her life was about to take a turn into the unknown. Chapter 3. Fractures in Time. The days blurred into one another. Amelia couldn't shake the feeling that she was being drawn toward something she couldn't yet see, something lurking just beyond her grasp. Every time she closed her eyes, the man from the bridge lingered in her thoughts, his cryptic words, the sense of urgency that radiated from him. Time itself had felt like a fragile thread, pulled taut between the past and the future, and she was caught somewhere in the middle, teetering on the edge of something impossible. The town of Elmsworth, usually quiet and uneventful, had begun to feel different. The air was heavier, charged with an electric anticipation that she couldn't explain. The world around her seemed to warp ever so slightly, as though the edges of reality were becoming less defined. She would notice small things, people walking past her, their faces slightly out of focus, as if they were phantoms caught in a moment they didn't quite belong to. The clock in her room, too, had begun to act strangely, sometimes ticking backward, other times skipping hours altogether. Amelia knew she couldn't ignore it any longer. She had to understand what was happening. She had to find him again, the man whose very presence had rewritten her understanding of reality. She returned to the bridge, though this time she felt different. There was no hesitation, no fear. Only the quiet certainty that she was supposed to be there, that the answers she sought were somewhere within the weave of time, waiting for her to uncover them. The bridge stretched before her, bathed in the pale light of the moon. The river below flowed with an eerie calm, its surface smooth like glass, reflecting the world around it with a surreal stillness. Amelia stood at the center of the bridge, her hands gripping the stone railing, her eyes scanning the empty space. She wasn't sure how long she stood there, lost in the quiet hum of her own thoughts. But just as she was beginning to doubt, a cold gust of wind swept through, and the man appeared once more. He was there, just as he had been before, his dark eyes locking onto hers. His presence felt different now, more solid, more real. Yet something about him seemed off, as if he were both there and not there at the same time. "You came back," he said, his voice low and familiar, but now carrying an edge of something darker. "You felt it, didn't you?" Amelia nodded slowly, her heart racing. "I feel everything, all the time. I don't understand what's happening to me. To this place." He took a step closer, his gaze never wavering. "What you're feeling is the fracture in time. The threads are breaking, Amelia. The fabric of everything is tearing apart, and you're caught in the middle of it." Amelia felt a wave of unease wash over her. "What do you mean? How can time break? How can I be part of it?" "You're a part of it because you were meant to be. You were never just a bystander, Amelia. You're tied to this place, to this moment, in ways you can't comprehend. You have the power to alter the course of things, but you must choose." "Choose what?" she whispered, her voice trembling. She had always thought that time was something that moved forward, immutable, irreversible. But now, standing before this man, that certainty was unraveling like a piece of yarn. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, his eyes seemed to drift into a faraway place, as if he were seeing something beyond her, beyond the world. The threads of time can be woven back together, or they can be torn apart completely. You have to decide which it will be. "How do I decide?" she asked, her throat tightening. "How do I fix this? What happens if I don't?" The man took a deep breath, and for the first time, Amelia saw something like sadness in his eyes. There are forces at work, forces that want to keep things as they are, to trap time in a loop. But there are others who seek to break it completely, to bring everything crashing down. If you fail to choose, everything will unravel. People will forget, memories will fade, and reality will become a hollow shell. "But you're part of this too, aren't you?" Amelia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're not just some stranger. You've been caught in this fracture, too." He nodded, his expression grave. "Yes, I was one of the first to feel the break, and now I'm here to guide you. But I can only do so much. The rest, it's up to you." Amelia felt her mind spinning, her thoughts a blur of fear and confusion. How could she possibly make such a choice? How could she understand the consequences of something so vast, so impossible? "I don't know if I'm strong enough for this," she admitted, her voice breaking. "How can I fix something I don't even understand?" "You already have," he said softly. "Just by being here, by standing at the center of the threads, you've already begun to unravel it. But now, you need to make the decision to either repair the fabric of time or to let it go." "How?" she asked desperately. "You'll know," he replied, his voice distant now. "When the time comes, you'll feel it. The choice will be clear." And then, just like that, he was gone again, fading into the shadows of the night, leaving Amelia standing alone on the bridge once more. The wind howled around her, and for a long moment, the world felt as if it was suspended in an endless silence. But deep down, Amelia could feel the weight of his words, a looming presence that hung over her like a storm cloud. The threads of time were breaking, and she was the only one who could choose whether to fix them, or to let everything fall apart. She closed her eyes, the cold air biting at her skin. It felt as though the very ground beneath her feet was shifting, as though the bridge itself was pulling her in, urging her to make her choice. But as she stood there, on the precipice of something she couldn't understand, one thought echoed in her mind, clear and unwavering. She had to find the answers. She had to know the truth. And perhaps, just perhaps, in the center of this fractured time, she would find herself. Chapter 4. The Choice of Shadows. The night was darker than it had ever been before. The stars hung low, their light dim and flickering like distant candles struggling against the wind. Amelia could feel the weight of the world pressing in on her as she walked through the empty streets of Elmsworth. The man's words still echoed in her mind, his voice like a haunting melody that refused to fade. "The threads are breaking," he had said. "It's up to you to decide." But how could she decide? How could she understand the stakes of a choice that she couldn't even begin to grasp? The weight of her responsibility seemed too much to bear. Time was not something she had ever given much thought to, until now. Now, it was as though she were standing on the edge of an abyss, looking down at the vast chasm of possibility, unsure of which path would lead her to salvation and which would lead to destruction. As she wandered aimlessly through the town, she realized that everything felt different. The streets she had known for years seemed unfamiliar, twisted somehow. The houses stood in strange, distorted angles, their outlines bending and shifting in the dim light. The world had become unrecognizable, as though it were slipping through her fingers, unraveling in slow motion. She knew she had to find him again. The man who had become her guide, her only connection to the strange forces at work in Elmsworth. But the question was, where would he be? And would he have the answers she needed? The wind picked up, cold and biting, and Amelia wrapped her arms around herself for warmth. Her footsteps echoed through the deserted streets as she made her way toward the outskirts of town, toward the old library, the place where she had first seen the strange photograph of the man 3 days ago. She didn't know why, but something inside her told her that if she was to find any answers, it would be there. The library stood in the distance, an imposing stone structure that had long been abandoned. It had once been a place of knowledge, filled with ancient books and records, but now it was little more than a forgotten relic of a time that had slipped away. The doors creaked open as Amelia stepped inside, the air inside thick with dust and the smell of old paper. The silence was suffocating. She made her way through the darkened aisles, her footsteps muffled by the worn carpet. The shelves were lined with books, but they seemed to grow out of place, their titles indecipherable, as though they had been written in a language she couldn't understand. Her fingers brushed against the spines of the books, feeling the faint tremor of something beyond them, something she couldn't quite place. Then, near the back of the library, something caught her eye. A door, barely visible, hidden behind a curtain of cobwebs. It was old, its wood warped and weathered by years of neglect. Without thinking, she approached the door and pushed it open. Inside was a small, dimly lit room. The walls were covered in maps, drawings, and strange symbols. There were piles of books and scattered papers on the floor, all marked with the same cryptic symbols that she had seen in the photograph. The room felt alive, as if it were pulsing with an energy she couldn't comprehend. And in the center of it all, sitting at an old wooden desk, was the man. He didn't look up at first. He was absorbed in the papers in front of him, his hands moving quickly over the sheets as though he were writing something. When Amelia stepped closer, his head lifted and their eyes met once more. This time, there was something different in his gaze, something deeper, more knowing. "You came," he said softly, his voice tinged with both surprise and sadness. "I didn't think you would." Amelia swallowed hard. "I don't know what's happening. I don't understand any of this. The town, it's changing. Everything is slipping away. I feel like I'm losing control." He nodded slowly, standing up from the desk. "That's because you are. The threads are already fraying, Amelia. You've felt it, haven't you? Time is no longer moving in a straight line. It's folding in on itself, collapsing. And if it's not stopped, everything will collapse with it." "But why me?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why am I part of this? Why did you appear to me?" He took a step toward her, his expression softening. "Because you're different, Amelia. You always have been. The moment you arrived in Elmsworth, you were caught in the fold. You were never meant to live a normal life. You were meant to be a catalyst, to choose the fate of this world, or let it unravel completely." The weight of his words crushed her chest. "I don't want this. I just want to live a normal life. I don't want to be a part of this, whatever this is." The man's face darkened. "You don't have a choice. No one does. Time is a force that cannot be ignored. It bends and shifts, and those who are meant to understand it, like you, can either mend the break or let it tear the world apart." Amelia felt a cold knot form in her stomach. "How do I fix it? How do I stop it from breaking?" He turned away, walking toward the far wall, where an old mirror stood. The mirror was cracked, its surface fractured like the very thing he was warning her about. "There's only one way, Amelia. You must step into the fracture. You must face the break in time itself." The mirror began to shimmer, the cracks in its surface glowing faintly, as though it were alive, breathing. Amelia could feel the pull of it, the urge to approach it, to touch it, but a deep fear held her back. She didn't know if she could do this. Could she really step into the fracture? Could she mend the fabric of time itself? "You must decide now," the man said, his voice quieter now, more distant. "If you step into the fracture, you will have the chance to fix everything, but the cost may be higher than you're willing to pay. If you choose not to, the world will fall apart, and you will forget everything. You will never remember that you even existed here." Amelia's heart raced. There was no time to think, no time to second-guess herself. The choice was clear. She stepped forward, her hand trembling as she reached toward the mirror. As her fingers brushed against the cracked surface, a surge of energy shot through her, and the world around her seemed to explode into light. In that moment, everything shifted. Time itself broke. And Amelia knew. Whatever happened next, nothing would ever be the same. Chapter 5. Into the Fracture. The world shattered. Amelia's body felt weightless, suspended in a space where time and reality folded over themselves like pages in a torn book. The air around her buzzed with a strange hum, a sound that was both deafening and silent at the same time. She wanted to scream, but her voice was swallowed by the immense, unfeeling void that stretched endlessly in every direction. It wasn't like falling. It was as though she was no longer tethered to the ground, to the world she had known. Every thought, every memory was slipping through her fingers, fading into the void around her. She reached out instinctively, her fingers grasping for something, anything that could anchor her. But there was nothing. No floor, no walls, no sky, just darkness and the hum. She didn't know how long she drifted in that strange limbo, feeling as though she were stretching toward something she couldn't see. But then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the hum grew louder, and the blackness around her began to shift. Faint light flickered in the distance, barely visible, but growing closer with every passing second. A shape emerged from the dark, a figure standing in the middle of it all. It was him. The man from the bridge. His eyes locked with hers, calm and intense, as though he had been waiting for her all along. His form was slightly blurry, as though he were both part of the darkness and separate from it. The lines of his body seemed to bend and shift like a mirage, impossible to hold on to. "You've made it," he said, his voice a whisper that reverberated around her, despite the quiet. "Where am I?" Amelia asked, her voice unsteady, her body trembling. "What is this place?" "This is the fracture," he replied. "The place between moments, where time no longer behaves as it should. It's where everything that's been lost, forgotten, or altered resides, where possibilities are born and erased in the blink of an eye." Amelia's mind reeled. "So is this what happens when time breaks? When the threads unravel?" He nodded. "Yes, the threads of time are not just linear, they're tangled, and when they tear, they leave behind spaces like this, places where the past, present, and future coexist in chaos. But not everything here is permanent. Some things, like you, can move between the fractures." "Move," Amelia repeated, still trying to process the enormity of what he was saying. "But I don't understand. If this is the fracture, how do I fix it? How do I—" The man raised a hand, silencing her. "The question isn't how you fix it, it's whether you should. You can mend the threads, but in doing so, you will rewrite everything. The world you know, the people you love. It will all be different. It will be like a new timeline where nothing that's happened before will ever be the same again. Do you want that?" Her heart raced in her chest. The choice was so much more than just mending time. It was rewriting it entirely. A fresh slate. But at what cost? Would it be worth it to sacrifice everything she knew, everything she was, to change the course of history? I don't know," she whispered, the weight of his words settling on her like a heavy fog. "What happens if I don't fix it? If I leave everything as it is?" "Then the world will continue to fracture," the man replied softly. "People will slip through the cracks, memories will fade, and time itself will collapse. It will be as if it was never meant to exist in the first place. You will forget everything that brought you here, and your place in the world will be lost to the past, to the fracture." Amelia swallowed hard, the gravity of his words pulling her into a spiral of indecision. She felt as though the very ground beneath her was crumbling, as though there was no choice that would not leave a piece of her behind. How could she make such a decision? "Why me?" she asked, almost pleading. "Why did you choose me to do this? Why didn't you stop it yourself?" The man's expression softened, his eyes meeting hers with a kind of quiet sorrow. "Because you're the only one who can. You're the only one who can walk between the threads. Time chose you, Amelia. It always has. You were born to be the catalyst. But now you have to decide if you want to be the one who saves it, or the one who lets it go." Amelia closed her eyes, the weight of the choice pressing down on her. She could feel the pulse of time all around her, a rhythm that was both foreign and familiar. It was as though the universe itself was waiting for her decision. The hum grew louder, like a heartbeat, faster and faster, echoing in her chest. For the first time since stepping into the fracture, Amelia felt a strange calm. She understood, in that moment, what she had to do. It wasn't about fixing time. It was about letting it be, letting it flow, letting it change, letting it break and heal on its own. With newfound clarity, she turned to face the man. "I don't want to rewrite everything," she said, her voice steady now. "I want to let time be what it is. It's fragile, and it's broken. But maybe that's what makes it worth living." The man smiled, a small, sad smile. "You've chosen wisely." And with that, the fracture began to close. The light around them intensified, and the hum slowly faded, like a song fading into the distance. Amelia felt herself being pulled back toward the world she had known, toward the reality she had left behind. As the fracture sealed itself and time began to reform, she understood that nothing would be the same. But she also understood that she didn't need to change it. She didn't need to control it. She just needed to live within it, to accept it and let it move forward. With one final glance at the man, who was now nothing more than a fading shadow, Amelia stepped forward, back into the world she knew. She felt the familiar pull of the earth beneath her feet, the cool night air against her skin, and she knew, without a doubt, that she had made the right choice. Time would continue to break, to bend, to stretch. But for Amelia, it was enough to be a part of it, to live within its cracks, its fractures, and to find beauty in the imperfection. And maybe, just maybe, that was the way it was always meant to be. Chapter 6. The Quiet Aftermath. Amelia awoke to the sound of birds chirping outside her window, the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze, a sound she hadn't realized she had missed until it was there again, filling her with a strange sense of peace. She opened her eyes, blinking against the sunlight streaming through the curtains, and for the first time in days, she felt truly grounded. As though she had returned from a dream, or from something much deeper, something that had taken everything and given her back what truly mattered. The world once again felt ordinary. It felt right. She sat up slowly, her body aching as if she had been through a long journey, though she couldn't quite remember the details. The memories of the fracture, of the man, of the choice, were all still there, but they felt distant, like echoes of something that had happened a long time ago. And perhaps, in a way, they had. Perhaps she had stepped into something more timeless than she could fully comprehend. But the weight of those memories didn't press down on her anymore. It was as though time had returned to its natural flow, unbroken, untangled. And the only thing that remained was the quiet truth she had found in the heart of the fracture. That time was fragile, beautiful in its imperfection, and something that could not be controlled or forced into any shape. She stood and walked over to the window, pulling back the curtains to let the sunlight spill into the room. The town of Elmsworth looked as it always had, peaceful, serene, with people walking down the cobblestone streets, the soft murmur of conversation drifting on the breeze. The clock tower in the distance chimed its usual song, and for the first time, it didn't sound like a warning. It was just the passage of time. As Amelia stood there, taking in the quiet beauty of the world, she felt a presence behind her. She turned, half expecting to see him, the man from the bridge. But there was no one. Just the empty room, the soft light filtering through the window, and the stillness that filled her heart. The choice she had made was final, irreversible, but it had been hers. And that, she realized, was what mattered most. She hadn't sought to undo the world. She had simply allowed it to be. She had let it breathe, and in doing so, she had learned to breathe with it. The door to her room creaked open, and her mother's voice called out from the hallway, cheerful and familiar. "Amelia, breakfast is ready." She smiled, a warmth spreading through her chest. "I'll be down in a minute," she called back. She turned away from the window, glancing at the clock on the wall. Time, her time, was flowing, unbroken, and she had a place in it, just as she had always known she would. As she made her way down the stairs, her heart light, her steps steady, she felt a strange, peaceful certainty. The fractures, the breaks, the chaos of the universe, they were no longer a weight upon her shoulders. They had been part of something bigger, something far more profound than she had ever understood. And though she would never fully grasp the true nature of what had happened, she had come to understand the most important thing of all, that sometimes the greatest gift is simply being present, to live within time as it is, to feel its ebb and flow, and to know that, in the end, that was enough. She stepped into the kitchen, where her mother was humming as she prepared breakfast. The sunlight slanted through the window, casting a warm glow over the room. Amelia's heart swelled with a quiet joy, and for the first time, in what felt like a lifetime, she felt truly at home. The world had changed, yes, but perhaps the greatest change had been within her. She had learned to embrace the flow of time, to live with its broken edges, and to trust that even in the fracture there was beauty to be found. And maybe that was the way it was always meant to be.